They came at dawn when the frost still clung to the thatched roofs, and the village pigs squealed at the scent of men. Emil barely had time to hide under his mother's old wool cloak when the soldiers kicked the door in. The smell of smoke, sweat, and unwashed leather filled the single-room hut, as armored boots trampled rushes scattered on the dirt floor. His mother pleaded with her thin arms outstretched, palms up like a peasant's prayer, but the soldiers dragged her away first. She was too old for tribute, so they left her weeping in the yard while they found Emil curled behind the hearth. They spoke no words to him, only tied his wrists with coarse rope, one guard spitting on the cold ashes as if the place itself offended him. Outside, snow fell in clumps, sticking to Emil's hair as they herded him onto a splintered cart already half full of wide-eyed villagers. He counted 8 others. One boy's lips were blue. A girl clutched a rag doll, its head missing, but no one comforted her. They rattled away down the frozen track, the village shrinking behind them, the trees looming ahead like the bars of a cell. By dusk, they reached the outskirts of the capital, towers silhouetted against a sickly sky, smoke from hundreds of chimneys mixed with the stench of burning refuse. Even here, rumors of plague lingered like ghosts. Bundles of straw soaked in vinegar hung from gates, meant to trap bad air. Soldiers forced them from the cart and into a courtyard surrounded by high walls, slick with moss. A monk in brown robes waited, holding a lantern that cast their faces in trembling light. He looked at each of them in turn, pressing rough fingers under chins, tipping heads back and forth. When his eyes fell on Emil, he paused, frowning, then whispered something to the captain. They separated Emil from the others. A cold stone corridor swallowed him next, footsteps echoing. The monk spoke now. In Latin Emil did not understand, but the word signum repeated like a hammer's strike. At the end of the corridor, heavy doors groaned open onto a hall dripping. Candle wax from iron chandeliers, tapestries of saints, and bleeding martyrs lined the walls. Emil shivered when the monk shoved him forward, toward a raised throne of dark oak. The emperor slouched there, a man of fur-lined robes, pale as milk, lips stained with wine. At his feet lay cushions embroidered with lions. Behind him, a priest whispered into his ear, the words sharp and quick. Emil felt small, smaller than the bones he'd seen dogs gnawing by the roadside. The emperor raised a hand, crooked one. Finger, and Emil was pushed to his knees on the cold marble floor. The emperor leaned forward, eyes glassy but focused. He whispered a name, soft as a prayer. Not Emil's name. The priest nodded. The monk pressed a damp cloth to Emil's filthy face, scrubbing until the skin burned. They stripped him of lice-ridden wool and dressed him in silk that smelled of cedar and candle smoke. Rings of beaten gold hung heavy around his thin neck. Emil's mother's voice drifted through his mind. Asterisk, stay small. Stay silent. Stay safe, asterisk. But there was no smallness that could hide him now. The emperor spoke again, asking if Emil knew why he was here. Emil did not answer. A guard cuffed his ear until he nodded. He did not understand. The priest declared that Emil carried a spirit reborn, the lost empress who died birthing a child that never breathed. The emperor's court, hungry for signs and omens, whispered that the empress's soul had found flesh again to heal the rotting kingdom, or so they claimed. Emil stared at the marble floor, heart hammering. A flea crawled along his collarbone. He did not dare flick it away. That night, they bathed him in scalding water mixed with rosemary and ashes. Monks shaved his hair to rid him of village pestilence. A small iron brand pressed behind his ear marked him as property, not of the crown, but of the emperor's bedchamber. Servants hushed each other when they looked at him, crossing themselves as if to ward off devils. Through narrow windows, he glimpsed fires burning beyond the palace walls, peasants huddled in muddy alleys. Inside, roast meat and stale wine perfumed the corridors. The emperor feasted nightly, demanding music and laughter to drown out the scratching claws of the plague at the gates. In the candlelight of his borrowed chamber, Emil traced the raised burn behind his ear. He pressed his palm over it, as if it could vanish. He thought of the old oak behind his mother's hut where birds nested in spring. Here there were no bird song, only the scratch of rats and the shuffle of silk slippers in shadowed halls. When he slept, he dreamed of his mother's hands, rough and cracked from soap-making, cupping his cheeks. But when he woke, only incense choked him, heavy with rose and decay. He mouthed his name once, Emil, but no one answered. The next morning, the priest called him by another name altogether. The first thing Emil noticed each dawn was the taste of damp stone. He slept on linen too fine for a peasant's back, but the walls sweated with old air, and the ceiling dripped mildew when the rains came. Servants entered before the sun rose, their eyes down, hands cold as they undressed him and scraped his skin raw with cloths dipped in vinegar and lye. They scrubbed away every hint of the village he'd once called home, dirt under his nails, hayseeds in his hair, the small scar on his hip where he'd fallen from a fence chasing fireflies. Each scrape of cloth seemed to whisper that he did not belong to himself anymore. After the washing came the layers of silk and wool, the emperor's colors only crimson trimmed with gold, no other dye allowed near his skin. They painted his cheeks with rose oil, so the emperor would not see the sickly pallor underneath. Meals were a thin broth, a crust of bread gone stale before it reached him, always served in dishes too fine for such meager scraps. He never tasted the roasted boar, or honey cakes that perfumed the feasting halls. Those belonged to the lords and ladies who drifted past him like moths drunk on lamplight. They called him blessed under their breath, then spat on the flagstones when they thought he couldn't hear. The palace itself felt like a mouth forever chewing on him. Long corridors draped in torn tapestries smelled of tallow smoke and rotting rushes. Candles flickered against walls, where rats darted in cracks no mason had bothered to fill. He learned quickly which tiles creaked, which corners hid lice nests, which doors hid monks waiting to drag him to another cleansing or forced prayer. If he fell asleep at the wrong time, they woke him with icy water. If he spoke when he wasn't told, they tugged his ear until it bled among the palace's shifting shadows. He found one face that looked at him like he was still made of flesh and not ghost. Jan never spoke. They'd cut his voice away long before Emil arrived, but his eyes, dark and soft, told stories in silence. Jan tended the stables once. He learned, until the emperor's priests demanded him for the inner halls. Now, Jan carried wash basins, changed linens, swept ashes. At night, when all others fled the emperor's pleasure feasts for fear of pestilence, Jan lingered. Once, when Emil coughed so hard, blood spotted his pillow, Jan pressed a strip of clean linen to his lips, wiped it away, and never flinched at the stained dot in the feasting hall. The emperor's voice carried over drunken laughter and the screech of vials. He liked to call Emil to his side, pressing cold rings to Emil's neck, forcing him to stand just behind the throne, while dancers swirled half-naked on fur rugs. Some nights the emperor demanded the hall filled with smoke burning, herbs to chase out plague, priests said, but Emil knew it was to hide the stench of bodies, unwashed for weeks. Servants collapsed at their posts, feverish and coughing. When they died, they were dragged away before dawn, dumped behind the kitchens. If any asked where the missing went, priests muttered words like cleansing and divine sacrifice. Emil never asked. He watched, listened, obeyed. They gave him prayers to recite at the emperor's feet. Lines about rebirth, mercy, eternal loyalty. He learned to say them without blinking, even when his stomach twisted with hunger so fierce he tasted bile. He watched courtiers drink themselves blind while the emperor demanded new games each night. Once, a maid whispered to him, asking his real name. She called him Little Fox, pressing a dried plum into his palm. By morning, she was gone. Jan found the plum later under Emil's pillow, wrapped it in a scrap of cloth, and hid it behind a loose stone. Days turned to weeks. Winter snow melted into spring mud. Rumors slithered through the corridors of pestilence, creeping into the outer wards of villagers too poor to bury their dead. Still, within these walls, torches blazed all night. Music rose to drown out the hush of rats. The emperor called for more wine, more meat, more warmth, pressed against his cold skin. Emil wondered if this was what ghosts felt like, trapped between breath and nothing. Sometimes, half awake before dawn, he imagined running to the garden gate, slipping past half-sleeping guards. He would see Jan's eyes urging him on, down the winding servant paths, to the city beyond the palace walls. But then the door would creak, the monk's voice would hiss orders, and another day would begin. He'd kneel while priests sprinkled salt around him to keep demons at bay. He'd smile when told, bow when ordered, breathe shallow so the sickness nesting in the palace air did not root deeper in his chest. He learned to listen for the emperor's footsteps, heavy, dragging, drunk on his own grief. When they came too close, Emil held his breath. He understood, with each passing day, that in this place of silk and rot, survival meant silence. It meant emptying himself of dreams and memories, becoming whatever shadow the emperor needed to see. And so he did, whispering the lines they gave him, letting the palace feed on him, piece by piece. In the name of love, that was never his own, Emil first heard the whispers when the coughing spread beyond the scullery. Servants dropped to their knees in the corridors. Rags pressed to their mouths as they hacked up red threads of life onto the same stones where they once knelt to polish the emperor's boots. The priests called it punishment for hidden sins. They blamed the cooks for spoiled meats, the maids for dirty linens. But soon they began to glance at Emil too long, when they thought he wouldn't notice. He saw it in their narrowed eyes, fear, that the spirit they claimed he carried had soured. The emperor had grown restless, more hollow behind his wine-stained lips. Where once he pressed Emil's hand to his cheek with trembling devotion, now he sat slumped among fallen goblets and spoiled fruit, staring through him as if he were glass. When Emil coughed, the emperor flinched, called for incense and priests to wash him with pungent oils that left his skin raw and peeling. The palace reeked of rotting meat and sickness masked with rosewater. When word spread of entire wings, sealed with boards and wax to keep the dying trapped inside, Emil understood that the walls were not meant to keep the world out but him in. Each day more guards appeared at the archways, armed with clubs to beat back the desperate who clawed at the gates. Inside, the feasts only grew louder. Wine poured like water while the people in the alleys fought over stale crusts thrown from the kitchen door. The emperor demanded more dancers, more chanting, more games to fill the echo where sense and duty once lived. One night, summoned to stand beside the throne, Emil stumbled. He felt the cold marble under his knees before he realized he had fallen. His forehead struck the steps. Gasps filled the hall. The emperor's eyes narrowed, searching Emil's face for the lover's ghost he had sworn lived behind his eyes. He found only the sweat and blood of a starving peasant boy. The emperor turned away, as if scorched by the sight. The next day the priests brought iron shackles, fitting them to Emil's wrists with muttered prayers. He was ordered to stand in the courtyard, chained to a post, while nobles watched from the balconies, feasting on figs and honeyed almonds. They called it cleansing. They called it penance. Some called him demon, others spiritless. He had never felt more human than when the rain soaked him and the world blurred behind a gray veil. Ioan came to him that night, unlocking the shackles, with trembling fingers, pressing a crust of bread to Emil's lips. Emil wanted to ask him to run, but the guards outside the gates had doubled. Beyond the walls, plague carts rattled through the streets each dawn, collecting bodies like dry kindling for mass pits. The city itself was eating its own dead. Where could they go? Jan wiped the crust crumbs from Emil's mouth and held his face for a heartbeat before slipping away. Emile sat awake until dawn, chains cold around his ankles, staring at the rotting tapestries that once showed paradise. In the courtyard days later, the emperor appeared again, barefoot, hair wild. He ordered the priests to strip Emile to the waist and pour vinegar over his back while chanting prayers for forgiveness. The emperor wept as the liquid bit into raw welts left by the iron cuffs. He whispered that if Emile did not heal the rot, he would bury him beneath the palace and summon another spirit in his place. Emile bit his tongue until blood filled his mouth rather than answer. He thought of his mother's face, the smell of hearth smoke, the scrape of sheep's wool between his fingers. All of it felt less real than the stones beneath his knees. Now that night he did not dream. He scratched his true name into the mortar beside his bed with a sliver of broken crockery, letters jagged but stubborn. He whispered it to himself like a curse he would never give the priests. Jan found the scratches, traced them with a trembling thumb, but said nothing. Only wrapped Emile's shoulders in a stolen blanket. The walls shivered with the screams of those dying in sealed rooms. No incense could mask it now. When dawn bled into the corridor, the monks arrived, with chains again. They dragged Emile past rows of staring servants, too afraid to speak. They locked him in a cell beneath the feasting hall, where the stones sweated night and day. A single guttering candle lit the mold that crept up from the floor, like rot in a tree. Above, he could hear the emperor demanding more wine, more dancers, more songs to hush the truth that no prayer, no borrowed spirit, could cure the hunger in the air. Emile curled on the straw, tracing his name over and over with a broken nail, until sleep claimed him, a promise that if he could not escape, at least he would not be lost to their lies entirely. The cell walls sweated, even in winter. Emile lay half awake, listening to the echo of footsteps overhead, the scraping of benches, the muffled laughter that bled through the stone. Once, he would have strained to hear the emperor's voice, searching for some sign that he still had a place beside that throne. Now, he knew better. He had not been summoned in days. He counted time in the mold that crept from the corners, the rats that came to sniff at the straw where he lay. The way his cough rattled deeper in his chest each dawn, he no longer smelled. The incense that choked the corridors above. The world in here tasted of rust and damp. They fed him little now, scraps left in a chipped bowl, pushed through the bars by servants who wouldn't meet his eyes. He heard them whisper once asterisk, "The emperor wants new signs asterisk." They spoke of a merchant's daughter brought to the palace, her hair the same black curl as the lost empress's. They said the emperor had grown bored with moldy spirits that coughed blood in the dark. Emile touched the brand behind his ear. The scar faded but still burning in his memory. He wondered if the merchant's daughter would feel it too, the slow hollowing dot. Once Johann came. He brought no food, only a cup of water and a thin scrap of cloth to wipe the blood from Emile's lips. His hands trembled as he brushed hair from Emile's eyes. In that quiet, Emile wanted to ask him to stay, to lie down on the straw and let the walls swallow them both. But he knew Jan would not. Jan's silence had kept him alive this long. Now it would carry him away when Emile was gone. Above him, the palace roared on. Priests carried relics through the streets, chanting blessings, to hold back the plague's hand. But the dead multiplied faster than the prayers. Whole families vanished behind bolted doors marked with charcoal crosses. In the markets, coins bought nothing. There was no bread left to sell. Nobles fled to country estates, wagons laden with tapestries and wine casks, dragging disease behind them like a curse stitched into the seams of velvet cloaks. Emile heard the guards speak of this as they shuffled past. He wondered if his mother's village still stood, or if it lay under fresh-turned earth. If she had lived, would she know his name still? Would she know the boy they took had vanished the moment silk touched his shoulders? In the dark, he mouthed his name like a prayer to no god in particular. The day the door creaked open for the last time, it was not Jan or the kind-eyed servant who used to slip him crusts. It was a monk, robes stiff with dried sweat, face half covered by a cloth soaked in vinegar. He did not speak. He only pointed. Emil's legs failed twice as he pushed himself upright. His bones felt hollow as bird cages. Each step from the cell scraped skin from his bare feet. The monk led him through passageways that smelled of smoke and damp straw. No one watched them go, no guard, no priest chanting blessings. Only the silence of a palace that had moved on to new games, new omens, new faces. They brought him to a narrow stone stairway behind the kitchens. There, the monk stopped, pressed something into Emil's palm, a dry crust of bread, mold blooming at its edges. A gesture, or pity, or penance. Emil could not tell. The monk turned away before Emil could ask why. He heard the lock grind behind him as the monk vanished up the stair. He stood alone in the cold, clutching the bread until it crumbled. Outside, the yard reeked of tallow smoke and scorched refuse. Shadows moved near the wall workers piling corpses onto wagons bound for pits beyond the gates. They did not see him, or if they did not care. Emil sank to the cold earth, pressed his hand to the scar behind his ear, and wondered if it would mark his bones when the earth took him. He let the crust drop from his fingers. He thought of Jan's warm hands, of a spring orchard blooming, somewhere far beyond the walls where no one spoke of spirits or blood or kings. When they found him at dawn, he was too light to lift without tearing skin from bone. They wrapped him in soiled linen, no words spoken. There was no record made, no prayer read. They hauled him out through the servants' gate and tipped him into a